First, I want to thank my good friend Andy McCarthy for that, it says here kind, but it should be lavish introduction. And it's obvious from that introduction that he is my good friend. I want to thank Frank Gaffney also for his kind words, and also for the work that he and the Center for Security Policy do day in and day out, year in and year out, to keep before a sometimes unwilling audience the threats to the security of this country, and to present a forum for developing the most effective ways to combat those threats. I would actually describe it as thankless work, but occasionally it does elicit tributes, one of which was alluded to by Andy, even though they may be unintentional. About a week ago, a publication, as you heard, with the sophisticated moniker, I should say, Salon, included one of these inadvertent tributes to Frank. Salon hosts a variety of left-wing bloggers who would otherwise have to look to their own devices in order to get their stuff out. But it included on May 16 a report by Salon's foreign policy correspondent to the effect that there is a struggle going on inside the conservative movement for the ear of Mitt Romney on how to deal with the Arab Spring in general and with the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. A struggle between what the author calls the neocons, which include such people as Senators Lindsay, Graham, and John McCain, who, if you really think about it, are neither particularly neo nor particularly con. And what the author labels the Islamophobes, whose ranks are, as you heard, are said to be led by Andy McCarthy and are said to include Frank Gaffney. Now, I kind of resent that article because I didn't make the cut. Although I think it's possible that I'm on the wait list, as they say on the Harvard faculty, and who knows, maybe tonight's award will get me a varsity spot. I think what Andy and Frank and others have done to earn their prominence on this list of so-called Islamophobes, by the way, a phobia is an irrational fear of something, and the term Islamophobia is inaccurate in two respects when applied to Frank and Andy. First, because that fear has nothing to do with Islam, but rather with Islamism, and it is anything but irrational. What they have done to earn membership on that list, to call attention to the fact that more than 10 years after 9/11, and in fact more than 60 years after one of the early Islamists declared that our society was incompatible with his religion, more than 20 years since the first act of violence in this country traceable to that movement, and more than 15 years after Osama bin Laden made specific what was already apparent by declaring that he and others like-minded were at war with us, we still seem to grapple with what it is that we're dealing with. Now, in a sense, we are constitutionally ill-equipped to deal with that, and here I mean constitutionally in two senses, both our written constitution and our national DNA. Perhaps because of bitter experience with the role of religion in public life in the 17th and 18th centuries, our Constitution in its very body, not just in the celebrated Bill of Rights, in Article 6, bars any religious test as a qualification for any public office. And then, of course, there's the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which is currently interpreted, reads religion out of the public square to the point where even a prayer at any official school function, be it a graduation or a football game, is forbidden. We tend to think of religion, if we think about it at all, as only one aspect of a person's life, and a private aspect at that. So in a sense, it's natural for a people who live in such an atmosphere not to be on the lookout for attack from others to whom religion is not simply a part of life or even a way of life, but is life itself, and life in which religion has a heavy political component. But that's where the attack is coming from, and 9/11 was certainly not the beginning. Actually, as a matter of history, Islamism, insofar as it holds this country in a sort of weird combination of awe and contempt, has been incubating for about as long as we knew about the other two isms that we successfully beat back in the last century. fascism, and communism. As a movement, distinct from the religion of Islam itself, and again, that's the sense in which I'm using it in these remarks, Islamism traces back to Egypt in the 1920s, when the loosely organized Muslim Brotherhood was established by a man named Hassan al-Banna, a primary school teacher and later an admirer of Adolf Hitler. Al-Banna founded the Muslim Brotherhood as a reaction to the modernizing influence of Kemal Ataturk, who had dismantled the shell of what was left of the Muslim Caliphate in Turkey, had banned fezzes and headscarves, and had dragged his country by the lapels, and it had to be the lapels because men were barred from wearing robes, into the 20th century. Al-Banna's principal disciple was also an educator, a bureaucrat in the education department of the Egyptian government named Sayyid al-Qutb, who caused enough trouble in Egypt to get himself awarded a traveling fellowship in 1948, the year al-Banna was killed in violence that was generated by the Muslim Brotherhood. That fellowship was intended to have the benign effect of getting him out of the country, and it did have that effect. But regrettably for us, he chose to travel to the United States, and in particular to Greeley, Colorado. Now, I think it would probably be hard to imagine a more sedate place than post-World War II Greeley, Colorado. But for Sayyid Qutb, it was Sodom and Gomorrah. He hated everything that he saw: American haircuts, enthusiasm for sports, jazz, what he called, these are his words, the animal-like mixing of the sexes, even in church. His conclusion was that Americans were, as he put it, numb to faith in art, faith in religion, faith in spiritual values altogether. Qutb went back to Egypt, quit the civil service, joined Hassan al-Banna's Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood continued to agitate for a return to fundamentalist Islam, so much so that he was tried for conspiracy against the government and was hanged in Egypt in 1966. At that time, many members of the Brotherhood fled to Saudi Arabia, where they found refuge and ideological sustenance. Qutb's brother was among those who fled and taught the doctrine in Saudi Arabia. Among his students were Ayman al-Zawahiri, an Egyptian who would later become a leading al-Qaeda ideologist, and the then obscure Osama bin Laden, the pampered child of one of the richest construction families in the country. And the rest, as they say, is history. That history did not come to these shores on September 11, 2001, or even on February 26, 1993, when a truck bomb went off in the basement of the World Trade Center, killing 6 people, wounding hundreds, and causing millions of dollars in damage that would eventually become known as the first World Trade Center bombing. Rather, it came at the latest in the 1980s, when a couple of FBI agents spotted a group of men taking what looked like particularly aggressive target practice at a shooting range out on Long Island in Calverton. When the agents approached, they were accused of what we now call racial profiling and backed off. In November 1990, one of the men participating in that target practice, El Said Nosair, would assassinate a right-wing Israeli politician named Meir Kahane after Kahane finished delivering a speech in the ballroom of a hotel here in Manhattan. The case was treated by the Manhattan DA as the lone act of a lone gunman. When the 1993 World Trade Center bombers demanded that Nosair be freed from jail, it became apparent that the Kahane assassination was not the lone act of a lone gunman. In fact, when authorities reviewed the amateur video of Kahane's speech the night that he was killed, they discovered that one of those 1993 bombers had been in the hole when Kahane was shot. And further investigation disclosed that another was driving what was supposed to be Nosair's getaway vehicle on that night in 1990 when Kahane was shot. And when they retrieved from a warehouse materials that had been seized from Nosair's apartment but had gone unexamined, they saw that it included documents that called for the destruction of Western civilization by toppling tall buildings. The man who served as the spiritual advisor to Nosair and to the 1993 Trade Center bombers, and who had issued the fatwa that resulted in the assassination in 1981 of Anwar Sadat, Omar Abdul Rahman, the so-called blind sheikh, who later would issue from jail the fatwa that authorized the 9/11 attack, was tried before me, along with Nosair and several others, and convicted for participating in a conspiracy to conduct a war of urban terror against this country, that included the Kahana murder, the first Trade Center bombing, and a plot to blow up other landmarks around New York and to assassinate Hosni Mubarak when he visited the United Nations. The list of unindicted co-conspirators in that case included Osama bin Laden, that pampered rich kid who had studied at the knee of Sayyid Qutb's brother in Saudi Arabia. All of this was treated as a series of crimes. Unconventional crimes, maybe, but merely crimes. In 1996 and again in 1998, Osama bin Laden declared that he and his cohorts were at war with the United States, a declaration that got little serious attention at the time. In 1998, our embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were almost simultaneously bombed, and again the criminal law was invoked with the usual mantra of bring them to justice, this time in an indictment that actually named bin Laden as a defendant. Apparently he was unimpressed, or at least undeterred, because in 2000, his group, Al-Qaeda, bombed the USS Cole in Aden, killing 16 US sailors, and would have carried out the bombing of another naval vessel, the USS the Sullivans, but for the fact that the barge carrying the explosives was overloaded and sank. And then, of course, came September 11, 2001, and to the call, bring them to justice, was added the call, bring justice to them. And we were told finally that we were at war, which was more than 50 years after Sayyid Qutb had determined that Islamists would have to make war on us, about 15 years after Islamists had made it clear that they were training for war with us, and 5 years after Osama bin Laden made it official with a declaration of war. Now, if Islamism were simply about folks who wanted to blow up things and people, that would be bad enough. But it might be something that we could deal with. I mean, after all, we have an intelligence network that sometimes, although not always, detects our enemies, and a robust military. But the violence is not the ultimate end. It's simply a means to that end. And to focus on the violence and refuse to examine the goal of the violence is like going to a play and focusing on the props rather than on the story. The story, the end meant to be served by the means of the violence, is the imposition of Sharia, which is a comprehensive framework that has spiritual aspects, to be sure, but is supposed to regulate all behavior, economic, social, legal, military, and political, because it is all-encompassing and lays claim to being divinely inspired. It regards the notion that people can determine the rules that govern any aspect of their lives, either themselves or through elected representatives, as anathema, as sacrilege, which is to say Sharia is totalitarian and profoundly anti-democratic. Hints of the comprehensive framework come peeking through even in prosecutions and episodes of support for violence that have been the subject of prosecution in civilian courts of this country. In the terrorism financing trial of an entity called the Holy Land Foundation in 2008, there was introduced in evidence a document entitled Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goal for the Group. The group apparently refers to the Muslim Brotherhood in America. The document was written in 1991 by a senior Hamas leader in the United States, and it explains that the Islamist movement is what the memo refers to as a, quote, settlement process to establish itself in the United States, and once established, to pursue a, quote, civilization jihadist mission led by the Muslim Brotherhood, what the author Robert Spencer has described, I think aptly, as stealth jihad. The document itself describes what it calls a civilization jihadist process as a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it is eliminated. And God's religion is made victorious over all other religions. God's religion is made victorious through the implementation of Sharia, the law of the land within what is referred to as the Dar al-Islam, or the home or realm of Islam. That is not, by the way, simply Muslim countries. It's any place where Muslims can and do exercise control or ever have. And so some neighborhoods in European cities where Muslims exercise control Notably in France, somewhat in England, and even in Sweden, Sharia is practiced and enforced in contravention and with the suppression of local law, with the result that some of those neighborhoods have become no-go zones for police and firefighters unless they have secured the explicit permission of local enforcers. Imposing Sharia in the Dar al-Harb, which is the abode of war, or the places where Sharia is not fully implemented, is the goal of jihad. Now, all of this is readily accessible, among other places, in a volume called Reliance of the Traveler, which is actually endorsed for its accuracy by Al-Azhar University, about which you heard a moment ago. Al-Azhar University is located in Cairo. It's a seat of learning founded in 975 AD. That is the institution that gave us Omar Abdul Rahman, the cleric tried before me, who was the spiritual authority behind the Sadat and Kahana assassinations, and both the First World Trade Center bombing and the 9/11 attack. And it was also the venue of President Obama's famous speech to the Muslim world in 2009. Are there then no moderate Muslims, none who are willing to live in peace long-term with their neighbors? Of course there are. And millions reside among us in the United States as loyal Americans, and millions more reside around the world. There are even places where they are in power, notably in Indonesia, which is the most populous Muslim country in the world. Some simply disregard the requirements of Sharia, and to that extent, I guess there's not so much reformist as unobservant. But a brave few are actually struggling to create within the religion a theoretical and doctrinal basis for combating supremacist Islam. They include, in the United States, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who heads the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and is about to publish a book called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, that I got a couple of weeks ago in galley proof, and that I hope you will all buy and read when it is published in early June. It is a riveting account of both his views and his personal struggle. Dr. Jasser is, by the way, not only a medical doctor, but also a former lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. At Princeton's James Madison program, an Australian academic, Abdullah Saeed, recently delivered a lecture arguing that there are ways in which one can use passages in the Quran and episodes in the life of Muhammad so as to oppose classical Sharia. The lecture is published in the November 2011 issue of First Things under the title, The Islamic Case for Religious Liberty. But the regrettable part of that story is that First Things, as I'm sure many of you know, is a Catholic, not a Muslim publication. But make no mistake, as numerous as they may be, among those who pronounce doctrine, the moderates are the distinct and weaker minority. The majority view was stated succinctly by a political leader lately prominent on the world stage. He said that the term moderate Islam is, as he put it, ugly and offensive. He said that there is no moderate or immoderate Islam. Islam is Islam. That's it. That politician is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Prime Minister of the increasingly powerful and influential Muslim nation of Turkey. And what of the vaunted Arab Spring? What indeed? As events unfolded in Tahrir Square, we in the United States saw lots of coverage about how the driving forces of the revolution relied on Twitter and Facebook, but not so much coverage of the public rape of a CBS journalist in Tahrir Square to shouts of Allahu Akbar, and even less coverage of the emergence in the Sinai Peninsula as a refuge for Hamas-trained terrorists who travel regularly from Gaza and who launch attacks that kill Israelis. There was, I think, virtually no coverage at all of the return to Egypt of Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who had been exiled from the country by Hosni Mubarak and who delivered a triumphant sermon in Tahrir Square upon his return. Qaradawi is praised in many quarters in the West as a liberal and a reformer who, among other things, stood up for women's rights. And so he did, even to the point of issuing a fatwa that authorizes women to participate in suicide bombings. In Tunisia, Islamists are in control. Their leader, Rashid Ghannouchi, like Qaradawi, recently returned from exile to lead his party, barely 5 years ago called for the hanging of 2 Tunisian intellectuals, one a woman, who were too vigorous for his taste in their support of women's rights. But even a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial staff, in a column in that paper a couple of months ago, assured us that Ghannouchi is a new breed of Islamist, with a sense of irony and a sense of humor. Ghannouchi even assured the journal editor that he would not seek to ban alcohol in Tunisia because it's well known that alcohol is consumed privately, and he recalled that the United States had an unpleasant experience when it tried that experiment several decades ago with prohibition. Quite an ironist and a humorist, and apparently the spiritual successor to that parade of Soviet premiers, remember back in the 1970s, who we were told as each one of them took power when his predecessor died, that he was a man of peace, because after all he drank scotch and listened to jazz. But isn't what's happening in Egypt and in Tunisia and in Turkey a manifestation of democracy? And aren't we duty-bound to support it because we stand for democracy? The answer to the first part of that question, as that great Islamophobe Andy McCarthy has astutely pointed out, is that that depends on what you mean by democracy. If you mean by democracy not only a process of majority rule, but also an underlying culture that includes protection of minority rights, then yes. But if you mean simply majority rule with no such underlying culture or tolerance, then what is happening in Egypt and Tunisia and Turkey is not democracy, and no, we are under no obligation to support that. If, as President Erdogan put it, to Islamists, democracy is just the train we board to reach our destination, the destination obviously is Islamist rule, and we have no obligation to support that. Why is it important in the struggle we are in that we understand all this? And by we, I'm not simply referring to the people in this room. Obviously, you all understand it or you wouldn't be here. I mean the nation at large. In past conflicts, that might not always have been self-evident, that we had to understand what our enemies were about. Perhaps it was not necessary when we fought the Axis powers in Germany and Japan to understand all the ins and outs of Nazism and fascism and the military culture of the Shinto religion. We could simply blast those countries to smithereens, as we in fact did, because the evil had its home base there. But it was much more necessary to understand the enemy when we fought communism, as Whittaker Chambers taught us, even when it was centered principally in the Soviet Union, because although it may have been centered there, it was not simply that nation, but its militant ideology that we were struggling with. Chambers prefaces his excellent book, Witness, with a preface that consists of a letter to his children, in which he explains why he went through what he did in order to expose communism for what it was, so that they could understand why it was that he had broken with communism and in the process had exposed himself and them to a life of torment. He points out that communism at its root offered the same promise as was offered by the serpent in Eden, that you shall be as gods. That communism dreamt of a world without God who would be superfluous. The great totalitarian isms of the last century and the one of the current century have in common that they all have dreams of a world without something they hate because they think it interferes with their ability to dominate the lives of human beings. Nazism dreamt of a world without Jews. Communism dreamt of a world without God. And Islamism also dreams of a world without something. It dreams of a world without infidels. And so we must understand this ism as well. How do we struggle against Islamism? Obviously, there are limits to how a government like ours can defend itself and the society it governs. If the First Amendment's Establishment Clause means anything, it means that our government can't pick winners and losers in doctrinal disputes. That's something the Muslims are going to have to do on their own. But it can take rational steps to defend itself and to avoid irrational steps that undermine its security. First, those charged with protecting our security have a duty to understand and to teach others under their authority to understand what the basic tenets are of the people who are trying to destroy our way of life. Imagine a president trying to mobilize the country against communism without teaching what communism was about. Also, those charged with protecting us have a responsibility to avoid strengthening the hand of those who are trying to undermine our way of life by relying on them as our principal interlocutors in the Muslim community. CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is a branch of Hamas and of the Muslim Brotherhood. ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, is another branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood traces itself back to Hassan al-Banna and Sayyid Qutb. Its motto, which has not changed to this day, is as follows: Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the faith of Allah is our highest hope. If those are the people we empower by relying on them and reaching out to them, we not only damage ourselves by giving them entry into the upper reaches of our political system, but we correspondingly strengthen them in the Islamic community and weaken the reasonable voices like those of Dr. Zuhdi Jasser and others. And speaking of weakening the reasonable voices like Zuhdi Jasser's, let me give you a glimpse of how people try to do that. Dr. Jasser was invited recently by a group to speak here in New York. And since one of the members of the group was a member of a prominent law firm here in town, that lawyer decided that he would host the speech. The senior manager of diversity development at that firm then received a 2-page letter on the letterhead of the Muslim Bar Association of New York, dated May 8. Now, I'm not going to read the whole letter, nor am I going to name the firm, but I think it would be useful for you to hear precisely how this works. The letter begins by announcing the writer's purpose, quote, to express concern regarding an event that is taking place at your firm. The event, of course, was Dr. Jasser's speech. The letter tells us that Mr. Jasser, and here there's no reference to either his medical degree and certainly none to his service in the U.S. Navy. Dr. Jasser is a controversial figure who has been closely linked to Islamophobia, there's that word again, in the United States, and many Muslim Americans regard his positions as offensive and troubling. The letter then goes on to say that this Bar Association, quote, has long been aware of this firm's commitment to diversity, inclusion, and tolerance, and it then goes on to recite several examples of diversity, inclusion, and tolerance that were directed at Muslims by this firm. It then returns to Zuhdi Jasser. Quote, despite the moderate facade that he and his American Islamic Forum for Democracy profess, Mr. Jasser has been directly linked to some of the most notorious purveyors of Islamophobia in the United States today. Mr. Jasser is the narrator of The Third Jihad, the anti-Muslim film that was the center of last year's NYPD training controversy. The film, which has been condemned by Muslim organizations and civil rights groups, was later characterized as wacky and inappropriate by the NYPD, unquote. The Islamophobes to whom Dr. Jasser is connected include, of course, Andy McCarthy and our host tonight. The Muslim organizations and civil rights groups that have condemned the firm naturally are CARE and ISNA, both Muslim Brotherhood fronts. So far as the film, I've seen it, and it's both balanced and intelligent, making clear that the producer and narrator, Dr. Jasser, himself a Muslim, has nothing against Islam or Muslims. And as for the characterization by the police department, that came at the direction of the mayor, who had not seen the film himself, and whose backbone, to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt, would be more rigid if it were strapped to a banana. The letter then goes on for a bit about Dr. Jasser and then comes to its penultimate paragraph. Quote, To be clear, the Muslim Bar Association fully and unconditionally supports Mr. Jasser's right to speak his mind and the host organization's right to invite him. We also recognize that law firms like yours regularly lend space to outside organizations for public and private events. As a partner in the mission to promote inclusion and diversity, we solely wanted to make sure you were aware of Mr. Jasser's track record and his stature within the Muslim legal community, especially in light of the inquiries we have received regarding, name of the firm's role in hosting Mr. Jasser. We are concerned that having such a divisive figure associated with your firm could undermine, name of firm's image with Muslim attorneys within and outside the firm, Muslim law students considering, name of the firm, and members of the Muslim community at large. In other words, as the heavy used to say in grade B movies, you've got such a pretty face. Wouldn't it be a shame if something happened to it? However, here I have to tell you that this story has a happy ending, because that speech was not canceled. It's going to go ahead. But our leaders have a duty not to strengthen the hand of people like the person who wrote that letter, and it has a duty to stop using them and their allies as targets of outreach. In addition, those charged with protecting us have a duty to avoid self-censorship and self-delusion that can wind up including others as well. For example, as you heard Andy McCarthy point out, the after-action report on Major Nidal Hassan's massacre at Fort Hood, which he preceded by shouting Allahu Akbar, does not mention the word Islam. The Army's Chief of Staff said on television after that massacre that the greatest tragedy would be if it had a negative effect on the Army's diversity program. John Brennan, a principal national security advisor and counterterrorism advisor to President Obama, told an audience at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, now this is a deep thinker talking to other deep thinkers, that, quote, violent extremists, unquote, attacking the United States are, as he put it, products of political, economic, and social forces, and shouldn't be described, quote, in religious terms, because to do so would create the mistaken impression that we are at war with Islam and thereby give credence to al-Qaeda propaganda. Products of political, economic, and social forces? Let's review the bidding. Osama bin Laden was a millionaire many times over. His successor, and also coincidentally, the folks who planned and carried out the 2007 attack on the Glasgow airport, are physicians. The perpetrators of the 9/11 attack were well-educated university students. Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, who tried to blow himself up along with his fellow passengers aboard an airplane over Detroit on Christmas Day in 2009, is the son of the former economics minister of Nigeria. Products of political, economic, and social forces? I mention John Brennan not because he's unique, but because he is a perfect symbol of the soft-headed diffidence that has infected the discourse of our public figures. Not that this is new to the point of being unprecedented. It isn't. The smart set in the 1920s ridiculed the values and lifestyle of what they called the bourgeoisie. Anti-communism was fashionable in some circles in the 1950s. And a great liberal judge, learned Hand, often called the greatest appellate judge ever to sit, said in an address called The Spirit of Liberty, that's quoted so often that it's become shop-worn, that the spirit of liberty is the spirit that is not too sure that it is right. Well, that may be, if not exactly true, at least an affordable indulgence at times. It may even have been an affordable indulgence at the time that Hand said it, which was in the late spring of 1944, when victory against the ism of that day was, if not exactly around the corner, at least pretty well certain. But today, when we are up against people who are sufficiently sure that they are right to fly airplanes into buildings, we had best make certain that the spirit of liberty is sure enough that it is right, and that those responsible for protecting us are sure enough that it is right to keep that spirit and us alive. Thank you again for the honor of this award and the even greater honor of speaking to you.